There is a story told across the New World, passed between sailors who never met each other but somehow tell it the same way, about a man who tried to die more than 40 times and failed every single one, and depending on who tells it, that story is either the funniest thing in the world or the saddest. Before he was called the strongest creature alive, before Wano burned under his rule, before the words beast pirates meant anything to anyone, Kaido was a boy, and almost nothing about that boy has ever been confirmed, which is itself worth sitting with for a moment. We do not know where he was born, we do not know who raised him or whether anyone truly did. What we know starts later, in fragments, the way so much of this world's deepest lore tends to arrive. The earliest confirmed detail is blunt to the point of discomfort. Kaido was taken as a child soldier, pressed into service by force, not by choice, and something about that early violence seems to have set the terms for everything that followed. It is worth pausing on that rather than rushing past it, because so much of Kaido's later mythology gets built on strength and destruction, and it is easy to forget the myth started with a kid who had no say in the life handed to him. At some point during that early servitude, accounts converge on a single, almost absurd fact. Kaido tried to escape by jumping into the sea, and instead of drowning the way anyone else would have, he simply did not. This is usually told as comedy. Sailors laughing about a man too tough to even manage his own death. But another quiet detail appears when you look at the framing and notice how much darker it becomes once seen from Kaido's side, rather than the crowd's. A person who wants to die and cannot is not living a joke. He is living something closer to a curse, and if that failure repeated across dozens of attempts, what we're looking at is not comic relief, but the origin of despair wearing a smile, because the alternative is unbearable. The number most often cited is over 40 attempts, spanning cliffs, drowning, and methods left mostly to implication, and whether that number is literal or folkloric exaggeration, the pattern it describes stays consistent. A body that refused to break the way bodies are supposed to. Some readers connect this resilience to his eventual devil fruit, the mythical Uo Uo no Mi, model Seryu, reasoning that some early monstrous constitution made him a fitting candidate, though exactly when he consumed it remains one of the persistent gaps in his story. What is not a gap, and may be one of the quietest character choices in the entire series, is the shift in tone that eventually occurs. Kaido stops describing himself as haunted by an inability to die, and starts describing himself as invincible. That reframing matters more than it first appears. The same fact, repeated failure to die, is horror read one way and legend read another, and Kaido seems to have made peace with the trauma not by resolving it, but by rewriting what it meant entirely. This is, in its way, one of the more human things about a character mostly framed as myth rather than man. The coping mechanism is recognizable. Turn the wound into a boast. Turn the thing that broke you into proof you cannot be broken. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this early trauma echoes later in Wano, in the careless way Kaido treats his own life and the lives around him, and it becomes hard not to wonder whether a man who failed to end his life eventually stopped valuing life at all, his own included. We should be careful here, since the source material never states this connection outright. It is interpretation built from pattern rather than confirmation, and Oda has a long history of letting readers draw threads themselves rather than spelling them out in dialogue. What can be said with more confidence is that somewhere in this period, tossed between crews, treated as expendable, Kaido began building the reputation that would define him. Not clever. Not calculating like some fellow emperors, but almost impossibly hard to stop. There's a detail sometimes cited about early skirmishes where Kaido, still young, still without his towering reputation, simply refused to go down in fights that should have ended him, and whether this was fruit-based durability already active, or sheer stubbornness is left ambiguous. It is worth remembering that this world treats strength as something legible almost immediately. Powerful people tend to recognize other powerful people fast, and if Kaido's early reputation was built on refusing to die, it would explain how an unnamed boy ended up on the radar of people who mattered. One of those people, eventually, was Rox D. Zebek, and the way that connection formed is itself part of the mythology, though the specifics of recruitment, whether sought out or seeking, are not detailed with any real precision in canon material. What we can say is that by the time Kaido appears in the historical record in any meaningful way, he is already treated as a figure of consequence, and that trajectory, from unnamed child soldier to crewmate of one of history's most feared men, implies a gap fans have spent years trying to fill. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Kaido and notice how little vanity exists in his self-presentation. compared to other emperors. He does not describe himself with theatrical flourish the way a figure like Doflamingo might. His self-mythology is blunter, built on the one thing nothing could take from him. This bluntness may itself be a product of his early life. Someone raised inside genuine powerlessness, whose body was used by others before it belonged to him, might reasonably build an identity around the one thing that could not be taken away. There's an argument, made more by tone than explicit text, that Kaido's later obsession with dying in battle, his repeated wish for a death worthy of him, mirrors those early failed suicide attempts. He couldn't die then, when he wanted to. Now he wants to die, but only on his own terms. That inversion, wanting death, but only spectacular death. Only a death confirming rather than undercutting the legend, is one of the more quietly tragic through lines in his character, suggesting the underlying despair from childhood never resolved. It simply got reorganized around new conditions. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Kaido's relationship to fear, or its apparent absence, and notice that this too may trace back to those early years. Someone who has already faced the worst thing a person can face, and had it failed to take, may simply run out of things left to fear. It is tempting, discussing a figure this large in size and legend, to skip past the human details and move straight to the destruction, straight to Wano, straight to the dragon and the wars. But the early material, thin as it is, seems to insist on being acknowledged first. Because everything Kaido becomes, the casual cruelty, the appetite for chaos, the strange inconsistent code of honor toward those he respects, seems to trace back to a boy who was property before he was a person, who found the only leverage available in a body that refused to quit. Some readers push back against reading too much sympathy into this origin, pointing out that other characters endure comparable or worse childhoods without becoming tyrants who burn countries and traffic in artificial devil fruits, and that pushback is fair. Origin is not destiny here, and Oda has made that point before. Still, origin shapes shape, even when it doesn't determine outcome, and Kaido's particular shape, a man who treats his own indestructibility as both proof and curse, seems inseparable from a childhood spent unable to escape a life that was never his choosing. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how rarely Kaido discusses his past at all, even in moments where other emperors might monologue about their history, and it starts to look less like missing material and more like a character who decided the past no longer mattered. That silence is worth sitting with. Big Mom talks about her childhood constantly, obsessively, revealing exactly how unresolved it remains. Kaido almost never does. He has built an identity so thoroughly around present strength that the past reads, in his framing, as already defeated, already survived, already irrelevant. Whether that's genuine peace or a very convincing performance of peace is not something the story answers directly, and it may be one of those questions Oda intends to leave permanently open. Not from oversight, but because some characters are more interesting left unresolved. There is a version of this story where Kaido's inability to die as a child is simply dark comedy, an Oda-style joke about a man too tough to even manage his own death, and that version isn't wrong exactly. The manga plays it partly for laughs, at least on the surface, but another quiet detail appears when you look underneath that comedy and notice how consistently this story uses laughter to disguise its heaviest material, how the funniest characters so often carry the deepest unresolved pain, and Kaido fits that pattern almost too well to be coincidence. It is possible, and this is speculation rather than fact, that the humor around Kaido's failed suicides was meant to make readers complicit in the same reframing Kaido performs on himself, laughing along with the legend rather than sitting with the boy underneath it. That reconsideration, if it exists, never arrives as clean redemption or clean explanation. Kaido remains, through most of the story, someone whose interiority is glimpsed rather than explained, treated as a force of nature more than a person, which may be exactly the treatment he spent his life trying to earn. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how other pirates of his era describe him, not with warmth, rarely with fear exactly, but with a kind of bewildered respect. The sense of a man operating by rules no one else quite understands. By the time he crosses paths with Roxy Sebek, whatever boy existed underneath the myth has mostly been buried, replaced by a young man whose defining trait, in the eyes of everyone around him, is simple durability. He does not go down. That fact becomes the foundation for everything after. It is worth noting, because it complicates any tidy narrative, that Kaido's eventual devil fruit ability, the power to become an actual dragon, layers a mythic dimension on top of an already mythic reputation, and untangling fruit from body is not something the text makes easy. Some analysis suggests the fruit came later, possibly well into his time with rocks or even after, which would mean the failed suicides and early battlefield survival happened while Kaido was, biologically, just an unusually tough human being, not yet the dragon legend remembers. If that timeline holds, it reframes the origin again. The myth of Kaido as unkillable didn't start with a devil fruit. It started with a body that, for reasons the story never explains, simply would not stop functioning, and the fruit, when it came, may have only confirmed a reputation already built. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how thoroughly this reputation preceded any fruit-based confirmation, and it raises a question the manga never answers. Was Kaido always destined for this? Or did years of surviving the unsurvivable simply harden him into someone the fruit eventually chose? There is no way to resolve that question with what's currently available, and it may be one of the genuine permanent gaps in his story, the kind left not from forgetting, but because some characters are more interesting partially unexplained. What we're left with, closing this earliest chapter, is a portrait built almost entirely from absence. No confirmed birthplace, no confirmed parents, no confirmed early relationships beyond forced servitude, and one recurring, almost mythic detail. A boy who tried to die and could not, over and over, until trying stopped meaning anything. That absence is, in its own way, the most honest possible introduction to who Kaido becomes. A man defined less by what shaped him, and more by what failed to break him, whose entire legend rests on subtraction, on everything that should have ended him and didn't. Before Wano, before the beast pirates, before the dragon and the sock, and the century of cruelty that follows, there was just a boy, thrown into a life he never chose, discovering by brutal accident that whatever the world tried to do to him, it wasn't going to be enough. That discovery would eventually curdle into something monstrous. But it began, as these things so often do, as something closer to survival than strength, closer to trauma than triumph. And it is worth remembering that distinction even as his story moves toward legend, toward war, toward Wano. Because the strongest creature in the world, before he was strong, before he was a creature, was just someone who couldn't die when he wanted to, and would spend the rest of his life turning that unbearable fact into the only power he had left to claim. There is one editorial choice worth naming directly here, since it shapes everything that follows. This account treats the sympathetic reading of Kaido's origin as the more compelling narrative thread, not because it is definitively correct, but because it is the interpretation that makes the rest of his story hurt in the way it seems designed to. For a character so often played as a punchline, so often filmed mid-laugh with a bottle of sake in hand, that hurt is easy to miss. But it is there, underneath the myth, in the space between a boy who could not die and a man who decided that meant something. There is a photograph that does not exist, a moment no artist has ever fully rendered, that nonetheless functions as one of the most important scenes in the entire history of this world. And that moment is simply this: the day Kaido joined a crew that history would later try, and fail, to erase. The Rocks Pirates are talked about now the way people talk about disasters that almost happened. A crew so dangerous that its very existence gets treated less as history and more as warning, and Kaido's place inside it is one of the clearest windows we have into who he was before Wano. We don't know exactly when he joined. We don't know what conversation, if any, preceded it or whether Rocks D. Zebek sought him out specifically, or simply absorbed him the way certain crews absorb anyone strong enough to survive proximity to their captain. What we do know is the company he kept. Big Mom sailed under that same flag. So did Whitebeard, before the two of them became rivals rather than crewmates. So did a young Silvers Rayleigh's future captain, Gold D. Roger, in a sense, standing as adversary rather than ally during this exact period. Another quiet detail appears when you look at that roster and notice how many future emperors, future legends, future defining forces of an entire era were gathered under one banner at the same time. And it becomes clear that Rocks wasn't building a crew so much as assembling a catastrophe. Kaido's rule within that catastrophe is described in fragments rather than full scenes. But the fragments agree on one thing: he was never treated as background muscle. Even surrounded by people who would each individually reshape the world, Kaido held a seat at the table that mattered. This matters more than it might initially seem, because the Rocks Pirates were not a crew of followers. Every major figure attached to that name went on to either become an emperor, a legend, or a name still spoken with weight decades later. To belong there was to already be extraordinary. It raises the question of what Kaido brought to that table specifically, beyond raw durability, beyond a body that wouldn't quit. And the honest answer is that the material doesn't fully say. We are told he was there. We are shown almost nothing of what he did while there. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how differently the story treats Kaido's Rocks-era presence compared to Big Mom's, whose ambitions and appetite are established even in this early period, while Kaido remains comparatively blank, a name on a roster rather than a fully rendered character. This blankness might be intentional. Oda has a habit of introducing legendary background before filling in the specifics, letting reputation arrive well ahead of interiority, and Kaido's Rocks-era silence fits that pattern, a placeholder waiting for a story that hasn't fully been told yet. What we can infer, cautiously, is temperament. A crew built from people this dangerous, this singular, would not have tolerated a passenger. Whatever Kaido did during this period, it was enough to keep him inside a group that historically discarded anyone who didn't measure up. There's a recurring theory among longtime readers that Kaido's rule in Rox's crew was less about strategy and more about sheer presence. The kind of person you put at the front of a fight, not because he plans anything, but because nothing on the other side can actually stop him. If that theory holds, it would track with everything established in his earlier years. A boy who couldn't die, a young man who wouldn't go down, becoming exactly the kind of asset a crew like Rox's would want. Not for cleverness, but for the simple fact of being nearly impossible to remove from a battlefield. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Kaido's eventual devil fruit, the dragon transformation, would fit almost too perfectly into this role, and it raises the possibility, again speculative, that he may have already possessed it by this point, giving Rox's crew a literal dragon among its ranks. The timeline here remains genuinely unclear, and this is one of the more frustrating gaps in Kaido's story for readers who want precision. Some interpretations place the fruit's consumption during this era, others push it later, into the years following Rox's collapse. The manga has not settled the question definitively. What is clearer is the general atmosphere of the era itself. This was a time before the Four Emperors existed as a formal designation, before the world government had fully mapped the threat posed by pirates operating at this scale, and Rock's crew functioned almost as a preview of dangers not yet named. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the world government eventually responded to this crew, not with a bounty, not with a blockade, but with something closer to panic, mobilizing forces in a way that suggests Rocks represented a threshold the government hadn't previously had to consider crossing. Kaido, inside that threshold crossing crew, existed alongside people whose ambitions varied wildly. Some wanted treasure, some wanted freedom, some, if later behavior is any indication, wanted something closer to reshaping the world structure entirely, and Rocks himself is remembered as chief among that last category. It's worth asking what Kaido wanted during this period, and the honest answer, again, is that the text doesn't tell us directly. His later behavior, obsessed with strength as an end in itself rather than a means to any particular goal, suggests he may not have shared Rox's larger ambitions at all. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Kaido's post-Rox life unfolds, chasing personal battles and eventually a single country, rather than anything resembling world domination. And it starts to look like Kaido's presence in Rox's crew may have been less ideological than incidental. A strong man drawn toward other strong men. This distinction matters for how we understand him going forward. Big Mom wanted an empire built from family and fear. Rox, by most accounts, wanted to unmake the existing order entirely. Kaido, even at this early stage, seems to have wanted something narrower and stranger, worthy opposition, a fight that could actually test him. If that's accurate, it recontextualizes his entire arc, including everything that eventually happens in Wano, not as an emperor building an empire in the traditional sense, but as a man perpetually searching for a wall he couldn't simply walk through, a search that would define decades of his life. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the sheer scale of names attached to the single crew, and notice that Kaido, for all his later dominance, was for this period simply one dangerous man among several equally dangerous people, a position he would likely never occupy again after Rox fell. There is something almost humbling in that, if you sit with it. The strongest creature in the world, a title he would eventually claim without much argument, spent his formative years as merely one legend among many, sharing a deck with people whose names alone still carry weight generations later. It raises the possibility that Kaido's later obsession with proving his own strength, his repeated demands for worthy battle, his fixation on dying only in a fight that mattered, traces back not just to childhood trauma, but to this specific period, Surrounded by peers he could never fully outshine while Rocks commanded the ship. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how little direct interaction is shown between Kaido and Rocks himself in available material. And it leaves open the question of what their actual relationship looked like, whether Kaido respected him, resented him, or simply followed him the way a force of nature follows terrain. We know Rocks was, by every account, a figure of near total authority even over people who would themselves become legends. Whitebeard deferred to him, however uneasily. Big Mom served under him. If Kaido held any independent ambition during this era, the structure of the crew likely required him to subordinate it. That subordination, if it existed, would not have come naturally to a man whose entire post-Rocks life reads as a rejection of subordination in any form, refusing alliances, refusing hierarchy, insisting on being the one who decides rather than the one who follows. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Kaido's post-Rocks trajectory, and notice how allergic he seems to ever occupying that follower position again. And it suggests the Rocks era may have taught him something uncomfortable about his own limits, a lesson he spent the rest of his life trying to outrun. This is speculative, and worth flagging clearly as such, since the manga does not confirm any specific psychological turn during this period. But the pattern afterward, a man who refuses partnership on anything but his own terms, aligns suspiciously well with someone who once had to accept exactly that kind of arrangement and did not enjoy it. There's also the question of what Kaido thought of his eventual crewmates turned rivals, particularly Whitebeard, whose later reputation as the world's strongest man would have made him, during the Rocks era, a peer rather than a legend still being built, and the two men's later rivalry likely has roots here. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how differently Kaido and Whitebeard would eventually be remembered. One is a figure many considered the closest thing to unambiguous strength the world had ever produced, the other as something closer to chaos given form, and both of them started, and probably, on the same crew. That shared origin makes their later rivalry read differently than a simple clash of ambitious strangers. These were men who had once stood on the same deck, under the same captain, and whatever respect or resentment developed between them during that period would have carried forward into everything that followed. It's worth noting, too, that Big Mom's later alliance with Kaido, one of the defining partnerships of the Four Emperors era, almost certainly traces its foundation back to this same crew. Two people who had already survived being subordinate to the same terrifying captain, finding in each other something like familiarity decades later. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how rare genuine trust is in Kaido's adult life, how few people he treats as anything close to an equal, and notice that Big Mom is one of the only names who qualifies. A pattern that becomes much less mysterious once you remember they share this exact history. Shared trauma, or something adjacent to it, tends to bind people in ways that outlast the circumstances that created it. And if the Rocks pirates functioned as a pressure cooker of ambition and danger, surviving that pressure together would explain a bond that otherwise seems to come from nowhere in the main narrative. This is one of the clearest cases in Kaido's story where the gaps in confirmed detail actually deepen the character rather than flattening him, because every reasonable inference about his time in Rocks' crew points toward the same conclusion. This period shaped him as much as, possibly more than, the years of failed suicide attempts before it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how confident, how settled, how fully formed Kaido seems by the time he reappears in the historical record after Rocks' fall. And it suggests that whatever uncertainty defined his childhood was largely resolved during the specific window, however briefly, aboard that single doomed ship. Doomed is the correct word, and worth sitting with before moving forward, because everyone reading this already knows how the Rocks pirates' story ends. The crew that gathered some of the most dangerous individuals the world had ever produced did not survive intact, and the event that ended them looms over everything discussed in this chapter. We'll get to that event directly in the chapter that follows. For now, it's worth holding on to this image Kaido young, already durable beyond reasonable explanation, standing among people who would each go on to define entire eras, none of them yet knowing how catastrophically their story together was about to end. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how little warning existed in universe for what was coming, how the Rocks pirates operated at the peak of their power with no apparent sense that their captain's ambitions were about to collide with a force capable of actually stopping them. That collision would reshape the entire pirate world, would scatter its most dangerous names into separate legends, would indirectly create the very structure of four emperors and warlords that would govern the seas for decades afterward, and Kaido walked out the other side of it, changed, but alive. Alive is again the operative word for a man whose entire mythology by this point already rested on refusing to stop being alive, and the events waiting in the next chapter would test that refusal in ways that make his earlier failed suicide attempts look almost gentle by comparison. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how many of Kaido's later behaviors, the paranoia around betrayal, the refusal to fully trust anyone outside Big Mom, the obsession with never again being subordinate to someone stronger, seem to trace directly back to whatever happened at the end of this chapter's events. We are, in other words, standing right before the single most consequential moment in Kaido's early life, a moment that doesn't just end a crew, but ends an entire version of who Kaido might have become, replacing it with the man history actually remembers. It's worth pausing here, before that moment arrives, to consider what might have happened if it hadn't. A version of Kaido who remained under rocks, who never had to build his own crew, who never conquered Wano because he never needed to prove anything alone, is a version that simply does not exist in any timeline we have access to. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how thoroughly that alternate version gets erased by what comes next, not gradually, but suddenly. In a single incident so consequential that the world government itself would spend years trying to bury the details from public record. That incident has a name, one whispered more than spoken directly even within the story's own world, and it marks the true beginning of the Kaido that Wano would eventually come to fear. Everything before it was preparation. Everything after it was consequence. The name of that incident is God Valley, and it deserves its own telling, in full, without the shorthand this chapter has relied on to get us here. Somewhere in the history of this world there exists a single day that the world government has worked harder to erase than almost any other. A day so consequential that even mentioning it directly tends to draw attention from people who would rather it stayed forgotten. And that day is God Valley. We don't get God Valley the way we get most major events in this story, delivered directly, narrated in full, witnessed by the reader as it happens. Instead, we get it sideways, in fragments, in a flashback triggered decades later, filtered through the memory of people who survived it and still don't fully understand what they saw. What we know for certain is this. The Rocks Pirates, at what may have been the peak of their collective power, moved against a location called God Valley. And whatever they intended to accomplish there, it did not go the way Rox Dieksebek had planned. Waiting for them, whether by coincidence or design remains genuinely unclear, was an alliance that should not have existed under normal circumstances. A young Gold D. Roger, not yet the Pirate King, alongside a young Monkey D. Garp, not yet a legendary Marine, fighting side by side against a common threat. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how strange that alliance actually is. A pirate and a Marine standing together against a shared enemy, and it tells you something about the scale of danger Rock's crew represented, that even natural enemies recognized a threat larger than their own rivalry. Kaido was there. This much the story confirms directly, placing him among the fighters on Rox's side during whatever chaos unfolded at God Valley, standing alongside Big Mom, alongside Whitebeard, alongside a captain whose ambitions had brought them all to this specific place, at this specific moment. What actually happened during the battle itself remains one of the most frustratingly incomplete sequences in the entire series, shown mostly through disconnected images rather than continuous narrative, fire and silhouettes, and the suggestion of overwhelming violence rather than a clear blow-by-blow account. We know the outcome even without the details. Rox Dieksebek was defeated. The crew that had gathered some of the most dangerous people in the world, that had seemed for a moment like it might reshape the entire structure of power across the seas, was broken apart in a single engagement. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the story frames this defeat, not as one side simply outfighting the other in a straightforward sense, but as something closer to a natural disaster, an event so violent and chaotic that even its survivors seem unable to fully reconstruct what happened. Garp himself, decades later, describes the events at God Valley with a kind of reluctance, the tone of a man recalling something he'd rather not revisit in detail, and that reluctance tells us as much about the scale of the incident as any direct description could. What we can infer, cautiously, is that Kaido survived this defeat in a state that matched everything established about him before it, battered, presumably, possibly grievously wounded, but alive, walking away from an engagement that ended his captain's ambitions and scattered his crewmates without ending him. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how consistent this pattern is becoming across every major early event in Kaido's life. Forced servitude survived, failed suicide attempts survived, and now the collapse of the most dangerous pirate crew in history survived, each time with Kaido still standing when the dust settled. The world government's response to God Valley is, in some ways, as revealing as the battle itself. Rather than publicizing the incident as a triumph, a case of law winning decisively against chaos, the government moved to suppress information about it almost entirely, treating the event less as a victory to celebrate and more as a secret to bury. This suppression raises uncomfortable questions the story leaves largely unanswered. Why hide a victory? What happened at God Valley that made the government's own forces, government-aligned figures among them, worth concealing rather than celebrating? And what does that suppression suggest about who was actually present and what they actually did? Another quiet detail appears when you look at the fact that a celestial dragon, a member of the world's absolute ruling class, was reportedly killed during this incident, and it becomes much easier to understand why the government would rather this entire event simply stopped existing in public memory. If a celestial dragon died at God Valley, the question of who killed them becomes one of the more charged mysteries in the series, and while the manga has not confirmed Kaido's direct involvement in that specific death, his presence at the battle puts him inside the circle of people who could plausibly have been responsible. This is speculation, and should be treated as such. But it's worth noting how well it would fit Kaido's later trajectory, a man who shows no particular reverence for the world government's authority, no hesitation in defying it outright once he builds his own power base in Wano decades later. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how little fear Kaido displays toward the world government throughout his adult life, treating its authority as an inconvenience rather than a genuine threat, and it becomes tempting to wonder whether that disregard traces back to having already, once, been present when their absolute authority proved breakable. Whether or not Kaido personally struck the blow that killed a celestial dragon, simply witnessing that such a thing was possible, that the untouchable could in fact be touched, would have been formative in a way that's hard to overstate for someone building an identity around defiance of limits. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Rox D, Zebek's fate specifically, and notice how thoroughly ambiguous it remains even now, with the manga never definitively confirming whether he died during the battle or simply vanished from history afterward, defeated so completely that his survival, if it happened, meant nothing to anyone who mattered. This ambiguity extends, in smaller ways, to most of the crew's fates. We know Whitebeard survived and went on to build his own legend. We know Big Mom survived and did the same. Kaido's survival is equally confirmed, though the immediate aftermath, what he did in the days and weeks following the battle, is left almost entirely blank. That blankness invites a kind of quiet devastation if you sit with it. A young man who had just watched the crew that gave him purpose, that gave him peers, that gave him a place among people who understood what it meant to be nearly unstoppable, get torn apart in a single afternoon. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how differently each surviving Rox member responded to this collapse. Whitebeard building a family-structured crew defined by loyalty, Big Mom building an empire defined by fear and appetite, and Kaido eventually building something that looked less like either and more like a fortress against ever needing anyone again. That divergence is worth dwelling on, because it suggests God Valley didn't just end a crew, it functioned as a kind of formative wound for everyone who survived it, each of them processing the same catastrophe into wildly different philosophies of power that would go on to define the next several decades of world history. For Whitebeard, the lesson seems to have been about family, about never again standing with people who weren't bound by genuine loyalty rather than simple proximity to danger. For Big Mom, the lesson seems to have been about control, about never again being vulnerable to abandonment in any form. Another quiet detail appears when you look at what Kaido's lesson might have been, and the honest answer again is that the text doesn't spell it out directly, leaving readers to infer from decades of subsequent behavior rather than any stated reflection from Kaido himself on what God Valley meant to him. If we take his post-Rox trajectory as evidence, obsessive pursuit of personal strength, refusal to build anything resembling the found family structure Whitebeard chose, refusal even to fully integrate into Big Mom's world despite their alliance, the lesson looks something like this. Never again depend on a structure bigger than yourself, because structures, no matter how dangerous, can still be broken. This would explain much of what follows in Kaido's story. A man who builds a crew, the Beast Pirates, but never quite treats it the way Whitebeard treated his own, never fully invests in the idea that strength comes from bonds rather than simply accumulating raw individual and structural power. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Kaido eventually approaches Wano specifically, not as a place to build community, not as a family in the way Whitebeard's crew functioned, but as a resource, a fortress, something to be extracted from and defended rather than belong to in any emotional sense. That approach, cold as it reads decades later, may have its roots in a single afternoon at God Valley, watching the closest thing he'd had to belonging get shattered by forces that, until that moment, he might not have believed could actually win. It's worth remembering, too, that Roger and Garp's involvement in this battle means Kaido's later reverence, however grudging, toward the Pirate King's legacy likely traces back to this exact confrontation, a rare instance of Kaido facing genuine defeat rather than simply refusing to lose. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how rarely Kaido shows respect toward anyone in his adult life, and notice that Roger's name, even decades later, tends to come up in his conversation with something closer to acknowledgement than contempt. A pattern that becomes far less mysterious once you remember Roger was on the other side of the one battle that actually beat him. This detail deserves emphasis because it complicates the simpler version of Kaido as a man who has never truly lost, a version his own mythology encourages, and that much of the fandom has absorbed uncritically. God Valley stands as clear evidence against that mythology, a battle Kaido was on the losing side of, in the most consequential defeat of the era. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Kaido chooses to remember, or not remember, this defeat in his later life, rarely discussing it directly, never framing Wano's eventual conquest explicitly as revenge or redemption for what happened decades earlier, even though the emotional through-line seems almost too obvious to be coincidental. If Kaido's entire post-Rock's identity is built around never again being on the losing side of an unstoppable alliance, then everything he does in Wano, consolidating absolute control, eliminating any possibility of an internal uprising, crushing potential resistance before it can organize, reads less like simple villainy and more like the overcorrection of a man determined never to relive God Valley. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how thoroughly Kaido's Wano rule depends on preventing exactly the kind of coalition that defeated Rocks, isolating the country, suppressing communication, ensuring no unified resistance, can form the way Roger and Garp's alliance formed against his old captain decades before. This reading, again speculative but consistently supported by pattern, suggests that Wano's entire occupation isn't just about resources or ambition. It's about control in the deepest sense, an attempt to build something God Valley proved Rocks never actually had, a position so thoroughly dominant that no alliance, however unlikely, could ever assemble the strength to break it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how personally Kaido seems to take any sign of organized resistance in Wano, treating even small acts of defiance with disproportionate violence, and it starts to look less like simple cruelty, and more like the reaction of a man who has seen, firsthand, exactly what organized resistance can accomplish against even the most powerful crew in the world. We are, in a sense, watching the aftermath of a trauma play out across an entire occupied country, decades removed from the original wound but still shaped by its logic, still responding to a threat that technically ended at God Valley but never actually stopped mattering to the man who survived it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how alone Kaido seems even at the height of his power in Wano, surrounded by subordinates but rarely by anything resembling the camaraderie he might have had aboard Rox's ship, and it suggests the fortress he built was as much emotional as it was physical. This is one of the more quietly tragic readings available in Kaido's story, though it requires holding multiple contradictory facts at once, that a man capable of immense cruelty, of burning an entire country under his rule, was also, underneath that cruelty, still responding to the loss of the one crew that ever made him feel like part of something larger than himself. It does not excuse anything that follows. Wano's suffering under his rule is real, extensively documented, and treated by the narrative with appropriate weight and horror. But understanding the shape of that suffering, the specific paranoid, isolating logic behind it, becomes clearer once you trace it back to this single afternoon and everything it took from him. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the story chooses to reveal God Valley so late, well into Kaido's arc, well after readers have already formed an impression of him as a straightforward force of chaos, and it forces a reconsideration of everything that came before, not as excuse but as context. Context matters here specifically because Oda rarely gives his antagonists this kind of backstory, without intending it to complicate the reader's relationship to them. In God Valley, revealed decades into Kaido's public reputation, functions exactly that way, retroactively deepening a character who might otherwise have remained a simple obstacle for the Straw Hats to overcome. What remains unclear, and may remain unclear permanently, is how Kaido processed the immediate aftermath. What happened to him in the days and weeks after Rox's defeat, where he went, who if anyone he turned to, and how a man who had just lost everything resembling structure in his life began building the next chapter of it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how quickly, by the standards of this story's own timeline, Kaido seems to reestablish himself as a major force after God Valley, suggesting whatever recovery period existed was either brief or largely invisible to the historical record we have access to. That recovery, however it happened, would eventually lead him toward independence, toward building something entirely his own, rather than remaining attached to Rox's shattered legacy. And the years immediately following God Valley, thin as they are in confirmed detail, represent the true beginning of Kaido as his own force, rather than simply Rox's subordinate. We'll trace that beginning next, the drift from a scattered survivor of history's most dangerous crew toward a man who would eventually decide he no longer needed anyone else's banner to sail under. Because whatever God Valley took from Kaido, it did not take his refusal to stop, and that refusal, older than the battle itself, older than Rox, older even than the failed suicide attempts of his childhood, would carry him forward into the next phase of a story the world was not yet ready to reckon with. There is a gap in Kaido's story that fans have argued over for years, a stretch of time between the fall of Rox D. Sebek and the emergence of Kaido as an independent force, and that gap, frustrating as it is for anyone wanting a complete timeline, may be one of the most important silences in the entire series. We don't know exactly how long this period lasted. We don't know where Kaido went immediately after God Valley, who he traveled with, if anyone, or what his first independent actions looked like once the structure of Rox's crew no longer existed to define him. What we know is the shape of what eventually emerged from that silence. Not a broken man, not someone diminished by catastrophic defeat, but a figure who reappears in the historical record with a reputation already reconstituted, already dangerous, already treated as a name worth fearing on his own merits. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how quickly, relative to the story's own internal timeline, Kaido seems to rebuild that reputation, and it suggests the raw material for it, the durability, the refusal to be stopped, never actually required Rox's crew to be effective. It only required an audience willing to notice. This period is sometimes referred to loosely by fans as Kaido's wandering years, though that term implies more aimlessness than the material actually supports. What little is confirmed suggests deliberate movement rather than drift, a man testing the boundaries of his own power now that no captain stood above him to direct it. We know eventually that Kaido crossed paths with figures who would matter later, and we know that his bounty, once it appears in confirmed record, reflects a threat level the government took seriously almost immediately, without the gradual escalation typically shown for pirates building reputation from nothing. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how differently Kaido's rise is framed compared to most other major pirates in this story, most of whom the narrative shows climbing incrementally, fight by fight, bounty increase by bounty increase, while Kaido simply appears, already formidable, as though his post-Rox reputation required no visible construction at all. This narrative choice, whether intentional shorthand or simply a gap Oda hasn't yet filled, reinforces something essential about how Kaido functions as a character. He isn't presented as someone who earned his fearsome status through a story we watch unfold. He's presented as someone who already possessed it, the story arriving after the fact to explain what we're already told to believe. It's worth considering what this means for how readers are meant to understand him. Most major pirates in this world get an origin story that builds sympathy or at least context before their power is fully revealed. Kaido gets power first, mythology second, an origin story, God Valley and beyond, delivered last of all, decades into his narrative presence. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this ordering shapes audience perception, allowing Kaido to function first as pure antagonist, then as complicated figure, then finally as something closer to tragic. And it's hard not to wonder whether this sequencing was a deliberate structural choice on Oda's part, rather than simple happenstance. Whatever the intent, the effect is clear. By the time we get the God Valley flashback, readers have already spent years understanding Kaido as Wano's tyrant, as the man who broke Odin, as a figure of near-total cruelty, and the backstory arrives too late to fully soften that impression, even as it complicates it. This chapter's focus, the ashes of empire years between Rox and the Beast Pirates, exists in that same complicated space, offering fragments rather than a full account. forcing us to infer rather than simply receive a clean narrative of how a scattered survivor became an emperor in his own right. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the confirmed timeline surrounding Whitebeard's rise during this same period, and notice how the two former crewmates seem to develop along parallel but entirely separate tracks. No confirmed contact. No confirmed rivalry yet, simply two men independently rebuilding reputation from the wreckage of the same catastrophe. That parallel development is worth sitting with, because it suggests something important about how this world processes power in the aftermath of disaster. Rock's crew didn't just produce one legendary survivor, it produced several, each independently reconstructing themselves into figures who would eventually be counted among the most dangerous people alive. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the eventual formalization of the Four Emperors title seems to trace directly back to this specific generation, Rock's former crew members, along with figures like Shanks, who would emerge slightly later, effectively inheriting the vacuum Rox's defeat had created in the structure of world power. If that inference holds, and the manga strongly implies it does, then God Valley didn't just end one crew. It restructured the entire balance of power across the Grand Line, scattering enough individually terrifying people into independent trajectories that an entirely new tier of authority, the Emperors, had to be invented to categorize what they became. Kaido's specific path through this restructuring remains the least documented of the major survivors, which is itself notable given how central he eventually becomes to the story. We get glimpses of Whitebeard's crew forming. We get glimpses of Big Mom's early empire building. Kaido's equivalent period is comparatively invisible. Another quiet detail appears when you look at what this invisibility might suggest about Kaido's temperament specifically. A man who, unlike Whitebeard or Big Mom, doesn't seem to have spent this period building a crew or an empire in any conventional sense, but rather establishing reputation through what can only be inferred as direct, personal confrontation. This tracks with everything else established about him. Kaido has never been shown as a natural organizer, a builder of systems the way Big Mom constructs alliances or Whitebeard constructs found family. His path to power, even in this shadowy early period, seems to run through individual dominance rather than structural accumulation. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this distinction eventually plays out in Wano, where Kaido's rule depends less on genuine loyalty, the kind Whitebeard commanded, and more on fear and raw capability, suggesting the ashes of empire years established a template he would never fully abandon, strength as the only currency that mattered. There's a theory popular among longtime readers that during this period Kaido specifically sought out fights with other powerful figures, not for territorial gain, but simply to test the limits of his own durability, a continuation of the same impulse that defined his earliest, darkest years, except now framed as strength rather than desperation. If that theory holds, it would mean the years immediately following Rox's fall functioned as a kind of extended proof of concept for Kaido, confirming again and again that whatever the world threw at him, he would still be standing afterward, building the specific brand of confidence that would eventually calcify into his declaration of being the strongest creature alive. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this period likely intersects with his eventual consumption of the Uo no Mi, and notice that if the fruit was acquired during these wandering years rather than during his time with Rox, it would mean Kaido spent this specific stretch of his life becoming something categorically different from what he had been before. The mythical class Zoan fruit, granting the ability to transform into an azure dragon, is unlike any other confirmed devil fruit power in the series, rare enough that its very existence had been treated as legend even within the story's own world, before Kaido's transformation confirmed it as real. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how thoroughly this fruit reshapes the mythology already forming around Kaido, a man already known for refusing to die now literally capable of taking dragon form, and it's easy to see how these two facts, biological stubbornness and mythical transformation, would compound into the specific legend that eventually surrounds him. We don't know precisely how Kaido acquired the fruit. Devil fruits in this world tend to circulate through complicated, often violent chains of possession, and Kaido's specific path to consuming this particular one is left entirely undocumented, another gap in a period already defined by gaps. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how little this ambiguity seems to bother most readers, compared to gaps elsewhere in the story, and it suggests something about how mythic Kaido's presentation already is by the time this fruit enters the picture. The specifics of acquisition feel almost beside the point next to the sheer fact of what he becomes. What matters more than the mechanism is the outcome, by whatever point the fruit was consumed. Whether during Rock's era or during this shadowy aftermath, Kaido emerges from this period as something the world had rarely if ever seen, a human being capable of becoming a literal dragon, on top of an already near mythical resistance to death. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this combination, biological refusal to die plus a devil fruit, granting one of the most powerful transformations in the series, essentially guarantees Kaido's eventual status among the most dominant figures of his era, almost regardless of any strategic or organizational skill he might or might not possess. This is worth dwelling on because it distinguishes Kaido from most of his fellow emperors in a specific way. Big Mom's power comes partly from her devil fruit, and partly from decades of careful alliance building and family construction. Whitebeard's power comes from his fruit, combined with genuine crew loyalty built over years. Kaido's power, by contrast, seems to require neither cleverness nor community. It simply requires him to show up. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this dynamic eventually shapes his approach to Wano specifically. A conquest that, unlike Big Mom's careful territorial alliances, seems to rely primarily on overwhelming force, applied directly and repeatedly until resistance simply stops being viable. A strategy that tracks perfectly with a man whose primary asset has always been raw, uncomplicated dominance. It's worth asking at this point in his story whether Kaido's reputation during these ashes of empire years was built more through actual conquest or simply through survival, through being present at enough violent confrontations and walking away from all of them that the reputation constructed itself without requiring any single decisive victory. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this pattern, reputation through survival rather than through singular decisive triumph, echoes his entire life up to this point, from the failed suicide attempts through God Valley itself, and it suggests Kaido's legend has always been built less on winning cleanly and more on simply refusing to lose completely. This distinction matters because it complicates any simple reading of Kaido as an unstoppable conqueror in the mold of, say, Roger or Whitebeard, figures whose legends rest heavily on clear, decisive victories. Kaido's legend, even in these formative post-Rocks years, seems to rest on something stranger, the accumulated weight of never quite being defeated, regardless of how many times he came close. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this specific brand of legend, built on survival rather than triumph, would eventually be tested and partially unmade in Wano itself, decades later against a coalition specifically assembled to finally end what God Valley had failed to end permanently. We're getting ahead of the story here, and it's worth pulling back to the immediate period this chapter concerns, the reconstruction of Kaido's reputation in the years following Rox's fall, a reconstruction that, however thin on confirmed detail, clearly succeeded well enough to position him among the founding names of the Four Emperors era. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how quickly this reconstructed reputation solidifies into something the world government treats as a permanent fixture of the world's power structure, granting him status that would remain essentially unchallenged for decades, right up until a coalition of pirates and former enemies finally arrived in Wano, prepared to challenge it directly. That challenge is still chapters away in this account. Before we get there, Kaido's path takes him toward the formal construction of his own crew, the Beast Pirates, an organization that would eventually become one of the most feared names on the Grand Line, and toward a philosophy of power distinct enough to warrant its own examination. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how deliberately Kaido seems to have avoided replicating either Whitebeard's family model or Big Mom's alliance model when building this new crew, choosing instead something closer to a collection of monsters and specialists bound less by loyalty than by shared capacity for violence. That choice, whether born from the lessons of God Valley or simply from Kaido's own temperament, would come to define the Beast Pirates as an organization fundamentally different from its rival crews, and understanding that difference requires stepping fully into the formation of the crew itself, which is where this account turns next. Before that turn, though, it's worth marking clearly what this chapter has actually established. Not a clean narrative of triumphant return, but a portrait built from gaps in inference. A man who disappears from the record broken and reappears formidable, with almost nothing confirmed about the specific journey between those two states. That gap, frustrating as it remains for anyone wanting completeness, may itself be the point. Some legends don't survive close examination of their formative years. Kaido's legend, strangely, seems to grow stronger the less we actually know about how he rebuilt it, as though the silence itself has become part of the myth. Every major crew in this story tells you something about the person who built it, and few crews make that truth as blunt, as almost architecturally obvious, as the Beast Pirates, an organization that reads less like a family and more like a collection of weapons Kaido decided to keep close, where Whitebeard built something explicitly modeled on fatherhood, where Big Mom built something explicitly modeled on an endless, monstrous family dinner table. Kaido built something that resembles neither, a crew whose closest real-world analog might be an arsenal, each member selected less for loyalty than for sheer specialized capacity to cause harm. This is not incidental. Every major figure within the Beast Pirates brings something singular and terrifying to the table, and the crew's internal structure, as much as we're shown of it, reflects a philosophy Kaido seems to have carried since his earliest post-Rocks years: strength first, and questions about loyalty a distant, almost irrelevant second. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the Flying Six specifically, the elite subgroup Kaido assembled beneath him, and notice how varied their backgrounds are, how little unifies them beyond raw capability. King, Queen, Jack, and the others, drawn from wildly different origins, races, and specialties, rather than any shared history or ideology. This assembly of specialists model stands in sharp contrast to how Whitebeard's commanders are typically framed, as people bound by genuine brotherhood forged over years of shared experience. The Flying Six, by comparison, read as exactly what their name implies: instruments chosen for function, arranged beneath a captain who values what they can do far more than who they are to him personally. Another quiet detail appears when you look at King specifically, a member the story eventually reveals to be one of the last surviving Lunarians, an entire race the world had believed extinct. And it becomes clear that Kaido's recruitment strategy specifically targeted the rare, the nearly mythical, the kind of asset that simply does not exist anywhere else in the world. This pattern repeats across the crew. Queen brings engineering brilliance twisted toward biological weaponization. Jack brings a Zoan fruit tied to one of the largest creatures in the world. Each major figure beneath Kaido represents not just strength, but a specific, often singular category of strength, assembled the way a collector might assemble rare and dangerous artifacts. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this collecting instinct extends beyond individual crew members into Kaido's broader operations, particularly the mass production of artificial Zoan fruits, the Smiles, an entire industrial project dedicated to manufacturing power on a scale no other emperor attempted at comparable volume. The Smile operation deserves specific attention here, because it reveals something crucial about Kaido's philosophy that goes beyond simple crew building. Where other emperors accumulate power through territory, through alliance, through inherited or earned loyalty, Kaido treats power itself as something that can be manufactured, replicated, distributed at scale like any other commodity. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the actual mechanics of the Smile fruits, artificial and unstable, granting the ability to transform only a single body part into that of an animal, often at the cost of the user's ability to laugh genuinely ever again. And it becomes clear that even Kaido's mass production power comes wrapped in a specific, casual cruelty. That cruelty is worth sitting with directly, because the Smile fruits are not simply a weapon or a business venture in the abstract. They are administered largely to people with little choice in the matter, transforming their bodies in exchange for combat utility while stripping away something as fundamental as authentic laughter. A detail that reads as almost poetically cruel once you consider it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how casually this cruelty gets folded into Kaido's broader operation, treated less as a moral question and more as an acceptable cost of manufacturing strength at scale. And it tells you something important about where Kaido's priorities actually sit once you strip away the mythology of the unstoppable dragon. This is a man who, whatever sympathy his origin story might generate, has built an entire industrial operation around converting other people's bodies into weapons, with apparent indifference to what that conversion costs them individually. The Beast Pirates, examined closely, are not simply fearsome. They are, in a very literal sense, built partly from harvested suffering. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this operation intersects with Wano specifically, since much of the Smile production and distribution eventually gets centered there, folding the country's suffering under Kaido's rule directly into his broader project of manufacturing power across the wider world, rather than treating Wano as separate from his larger ambitions. This connection matters because it complicates any reading of Kaido's Wano occupation as simply personal, a grudge against Odin or a straightforward territorial conquest. Wano under his rule functions as infrastructure, a manufacturing base for a much larger operation extending across multiple territories and, implicitly, multiple criminal organizations willing to distribute what he produces. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Kaido's business relationship with figures like Caesar Clown, whose expertise in chemical and biological weapons made him a valuable, if unstable, asset within this broader manufacturing project. And it reinforces how much of Kaido's operation runs on exploiting specialized, often morally compromised expertise, rather than raw personal loyalty. This willingness to work with someone as volatile and self-interested as Caesar suggests Kaido's crew-building philosophy extends beyond even the beast pirates proper, into a wider network of contractors and specialists bound by mutual interest rather than any deeper allegiance, a structure closer to organized crime than to the traditional pirate crew model established elsewhere in the series. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how thoroughly this business-like approach to power contrasts with Kaido's own personal mythology, a man who publicly frames himself as obsessed with pure strength, worthy battle, and glorious death, while privately running what amounts to an industrial weapons operation built on exploitation and manufactured suffering. That contrast might be the single most revealing thing about Kaido as a character. The myth he tells about himself, and that much of the world seems to believe, is one of simple brute strength, a man who cares only about fighting and drinking and dying gloriously. The reality, examined through the beast pirate's actual operations, is considerably more calculated and considerably darker. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how rarely the narrative directly calls attention to this contrast, letting readers piece it together from the accumulated weight of details scattered across many chapters, rather than stating it outright, which is consistent with how Oda tends to handle Kaido's characterization throughout the series. This indirect approach means audiences who engage only casually with Kaido's story might walk away remembering primarily the mythology, the dragon, the sake, the demand for worthy opponents, while missing the quieter, more damning details about smile production and forced transformation buried in the margins of his larger arc. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this dual characterization, mythic strongman on the surface and calculated exploiter underneath, mirrors the earlier dual reading of his childhood, comic on the surface and tragic underneath, and it starts to look like a consistent pattern in how Oda constructs this specific character across every phase of his story. Kaido, examined this way, becomes a figure built almost entirely from surface versus substance tension, comedy over trauma in his childhood, mythology over industry in his adulthood, each layer requiring readers to look past the immediately obvious framing to find something considerably less comfortable underneath. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the Beast Pirates' organizational structure ultimately serves this same tension, presenting itself outwardly as a collection of monstrous individual legends, while functioning internally as something closer to a supply chain, each member and each operation feeding into a larger project of manufactured, distributed power. It's worth asking what Kaido himself understands about this contrast, whether he genuinely believes his own mythology of pure strength worship, or whether the industrial exploitation underlying his operation represents a more calculated, more self-aware version of the man than his public behavior typically suggests. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how few moments in the manga show Kaido personally engaged with the mechanics of smile production or crew recruitment strategy, most of that groundwork attributed instead to subordinates like Queen. And it raises the possibility that Kaido himself remains genuinely disengaged from the darker infrastructure his name presides over. If that's the case, it would suggest a kind of willful blindness rather than calculated cruelty, a captain who cares primarily about strength in battle, and leaves the unglamorous machinery of exploitation to subordinates, who handle it without requiring his direct attention or approval, a distinction that doesn't excuse the outcome but does complicate the psychology behind it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this dynamic tracks with everything established about Kaido's temperament in earlier chapters. A man uninterested in structure building for its own sake, more interested in individual dominance and worthy confrontation than in the administrative details of running an empire, even one built substantially on his own name and reputation. This reading doesn't soften the outcome. Wano still suffers. The smile users still lose something as fundamental as their own genuine laughter. But it does suggest a captain whose personal obsessions, strength, battle, mythology, exist somewhat separately from the machinery his crew has built around him, machinery that may run largely on its own momentum, rather than his direct daily oversight. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the Flying Six themselves seem to operate with considerable autonomy, each managing their own domains within Wano, with minimal apparent interference from Kaido personally. And it reinforces this picture of a captain who provides the intimidating figurehead, while others manage the actual operational cruelty underneath him. This structure, a fearsome captain presiding loosely over subordinates who handle the details, is not unique to Kaido among the emperors, but it takes on a specific weight in his case, given how much of his personal mythology is built around individual strength rather than organizational skill, suggesting the beast pirates function less as his creation in any granular sense, and more as an ecosystem that formed around his reputation. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how differently this reads compared to Big Mom's operation, where her direct, obsessive involvement in every aspect of her family and territory is heavily emphasized throughout the story, making Kaido's comparative distance from his own crew's machinery feel like a deliberate character contrast rather than simple narrative gap. Whatever the precise balance of direct cruelty versus willful disengagement, the outcome remains the same for everyone caught within the Beast Pirates' orbit. Wano suffers under an occupation that treats the country as infrastructure. Smile users suffer under a process that treats their bodies as manufacturing material. And the crew itself, for all its individual talent, functions less as family and more as a carefully assembled collection of instruments. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this collection ultimately serves Kaido's singular, narrower goal. Not empire in the way Big Mom pursues it, not legacy in the way Whitebeard pursues it, but something closer to the pure accumulation of strength around himself, a fortress built from other people's power rather than genuine connection. That fortress, industrial and monstrous as it becomes, still traces back to the same wound this account has followed since the beginning, a man who lost the closest thing he'd had to belonging at God Valley, and who responded not by seeking connection again, but by surrounding himself instead with raw, undeniable manufactured power, the one thing he could be certain wouldn't abandon him the way Rox's crew ultimately did. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how thoroughly this fortress-building instinct would eventually collide with Wano's own history, a country with its own deep wounds, its own legends, and its own eventual champion in Kozuki Oden, whose story intersects with Kaido's in ways that would define the next major chapter of both their legacies. That intersection, Kaido's first true confrontation with Wano and with a man who would become his most significant early adversary, deserves its own full account. One that moves us from the industrial machinery of the Beast Pirates towards something closer to genuine personal rivalry, the kind Kaido's entire post-Rox life seems to have been quietly searching for all along. We turn to that rivalry next, into an era before the Wano conquest fully solidified, when Kaido was still an emperor among several rather than the singular tyrant history would eventually remember him as. There is a rivalry in this story that never gets a proper final battle, never gets resolved on panel in the way most major conflicts eventually are. And that unresolved quality might be exactly the point, because the relationship between Kaido and Whitebeard was never really about winning in the first place. By the time both men had solidified their positions among the four emperors, the world had settled into an uneasy structure, four titanic powers dividing the new world between them, not through any formal agreement but through the simple, brutal fact that none of them could easily remove the others. Whitebeard occupied a position unlike any of his peers, widely regarded, even by rivals, as the closest thing the world had to an undisputed strongest man, a reputation built not just on his Devil Fruit's earthquake power, but on decades of consistent, overwhelming demonstration against every challenger who tried to prove otherwise. Kaido, by contrast, occupied a stranger position, feared, certainly, powerful beyond question, but never quite granted the same universal deference Whitebeard commanded, and this distinction seems to have mattered to Kaido more than most of his other rivalries or alliances throughout his adult life. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how directly Kaido challenged Whitebeard. Not once, but repeatedly over the years, seeking confrontation with a persistence that goes beyond simple territorial ambition, and it starts to look like something closer to an obsession, a need to test himself specifically against the one peer whose reputation exceeded his own. The confirmed history here is thin, but consistent. Kaido moved against Whitebeard's territory on multiple occasions, and each time, by every account available, he was repelled. Not narrowly, not through some lucky intervention, but decisively, in a way that should have been humiliating for a man whose entire identity rested on never truly losing. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Kaido processed these repeated defeats, and notice that rather than retreating from the rivalry entirely, he kept returning to it, a pattern that reads less like strategic miscalculation and more like a man who needed this specific confrontation to keep happening, regardless of outcome. This compulsive return to a fight he couldn't win connects directly back to everything established in earlier chapters about Kaido's relationship to death and defeat. He has spent his entire life searching for something capable of actually stopping him, and Whitebeard, uniquely among his contemporaries, seems to have represented the closest thing to that possibility. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Kaido's own words about this rivalry, expressed later in his life with a strange kind of respect layered underneath the obvious frustration. And it becomes clear that whatever these confrontations cost him strategically, they also gave him something he seemed to value more than territorial gain, proof that a worthy wall still existed somewhere in the world. This reading recontextualizes the entire rivalry. Kaido wasn't simply trying and failing to conquer Whitebeard's territory. He may have been, on some level conscious or otherwise, seeking exactly the kind of defeat that would finally mean something. A death or a loss significant enough to answer the question his childhood suicide attempts never could. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Whitebeard, for his part, seems to have treated these confrontations with something closer to weary tolerance than genuine animosity, defending his territory effectively but never pursuing Kaido with the same obsessive energy Kaido brought to the rivalry, suggesting an asymmetry in how much this relationship actually mattered to each man. This asymmetry is worth sitting with, because it tells you something important about where each man's story was heading. Whitebeard had built a family, a purpose, a legacy that didn't require Kaido's validation or defeat to feel complete. Kaido, by contrast, seems to have needed this rivalry in a way that suggests his own sense of purpose remained unresolved. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this dynamic mirrors the earlier discussion of God Valley, both men having survived the same catastrophic collapse of their shared crew, and notice that Whitebeard emerged from that collapse building something forward-facing, while Kaido emerged from it seemingly still searching for the confrontation that never quite arrived at God Valley itself. There's an argument to be made that Kaido's entire rivalry with Whitebeard functioned as a kind of surrogate for whatever remained unresolved from their shared history under rocks, a way of continuing a confrontation that technically ended at God Valley but never actually settled anything between the individual survivors who walked away from it. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how rarely the manga shows direct dialogue between these two men outside of brief, charged moments, and it reinforces the sense that whatever passed between them during their shared time under rocks was never fully articulated, left instead to simmer beneath decades of subsequent territorial conflict. We don't get a definitive final battle between Kaido and Whitebeard in the main story, and this absence has generated significant fan speculation over the years about what it might have looked like. Whether Kaido would have finally found the death he seemed to be searching for, or whether Whitebeard's overwhelming power would have simply repelled him one more time. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the timing of Whitebeard's eventual death, occurring during the Battle of Marineford under entirely different circumstances, facing entirely different opponents, and it means Kaido never got the resolution his decades of pursuit seemed to be building toward, a rivalry that simply ended, unfinished, when its other half died fighting someone else entirely. This is worth sitting with as one of the more quietly devastating details in Kaido's larger arc. A man who spent years seeking a worthy death against a specific rival was denied even that, watching or hearing about Whitebeard's death from a distance, robbed of the confrontation he seemed to need more than almost anything else in his adult life. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Kaido reacted, or is shown to react, to Whitebeard's death. And notice that the manga gives us remarkably little direct emotional content here. Another silence in a story already defined by silences around Kaido's genuine interiority. We can infer, cautiously, that this loss mattered to him, given how much of his identity seems to have been built around the ongoing possibility of finally settling things with Whitebeard. But the text itself resists confirming this directly, leaving readers once again to construct meaning from absence rather than explicit statement. Another quiet detail appears when you look at what happened in the aftermath of Marineford more broadly, the reshuffling of power across the New World following Whitebeard's death, and notice that Kaido's position, rather than being strengthened by his rival's absence, seems to have simply continued along its existing trajectory, unchanged by the removal of the one figure who might have finally tested him. This lack of dramatic shift is itself revealing. If Kaido's rivalry with Whitebeard had been primarily about territorial ambition, Whitebeard's death should have opened opportunities, expansion, conquest, the kind of power grab other emperors might have pursued in the resulting vacuum. Instead, Kaido's attention seems to have already been narrowing toward a different target entirely: Wano. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the timeline here, and notice that Kaido's serious moves toward Wano predate Whitebeard's death by a significant margin, suggesting the rivalry with Whitebeard and the ambition toward Wano were running as parallel obsessions rather than sequential ones, each occupying a different, specific need within Kaido's broader psychology. This parallel structure makes sense once you consider what each pursuit seems to have offered him. Whitebeard represented the possibility of a worthy death, a final answer to decades of searching for something capable of actually stopping him. Wano represented something different, a permanent, defensible fortress, the structural safety Kaido seems to have craved ever since God Valley took his first one away. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how these two pursuits, worthy death and permanent fortress, sit in direct tension with each other. And it captures something essential about Kaido's contradictions as a character, simultaneously seeking his own destruction and seeking absolute unbreakable security, as though he never fully resolved which version of himself he actually wanted to become. This tension doesn't resolve cleanly anywhere in the story. Kaido pursues both paths simultaneously for years, challenging Whitebeard while also laying groundwork in Wano, and the eventual outcome, Whitebeard's death removing one obsession while Wano's conquest fulfills the other, leaves Kaido in a strange position by the time his story's main events actually begin. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how thoroughly Wano's conquest, once achieved, seems to leave Kaido unsatisfied despite representing the fulfillment of decades of ambition, drinking heavily, expressing repeated dissatisfaction with the quality of opposition he faces, and it suggests the fortress he built never actually addressed the deeper need Whitebeard's rivalry had represented. This dissatisfaction becomes one of the more genuinely tragic undercurrents running through Kaido's later characterization. He achieves the structural security he seems to have wanted since God Valley, an entire country under his absolute control, and finds that security hollow, insufficient, because the other half of what he needed, a worthy death, a genuine test, remains permanently unresolved after Whitebeard's passing. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this dissatisfaction manifests specifically as a search for new worthy opponents throughout the Wano arc, Kaido repeatedly expressing disappointment in the strength of those who challenge him, right up until Luffy's arrival finally offers something closer to what he'd been missing since Whitebeard's death removed his previous outlet. This framing recontextualizes Luffy's eventual role in Kaido's story significantly. He isn't simply an obstacle for the Straw Hats to overcome on their way to liberating Wano. He becomes, gradually, the replacement for a rivalry that Kaido lost the chance to resolve, the new possibility of a death or defeat significant enough to finally mean something. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how explicitly Kaido eventually states something close to this sentiment directly to Luffy during their confrontations, expressing a kind of grim satisfaction in facing someone who might actually be capable of ending him. Language that echoes almost exactly the energy of his earlier pursuit of Whitebeard decades before. This continuity across decades, from Whitebeard to Luffy, from one search for a worthy end to another, ties Kaido's entire adult life together into a single through line that the God Valley origin makes newly legible. A man who has never stopped looking for the confrontation his childhood suicide attempts failed to provide, searching first in Rox's crew, then in Whitebeard's rivalry, then finally in Wano itself. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this through line complicates any simple villain reading of Kaido, not by excusing his cruelty, which remains real and significant, but by revealing the specific, consistent psychological engine driving decades of his behavior, a search for meaning through confrontation that never quite resolves, no matter how much power he accumulates along the way. Before we reach Wano's full conquest and the confrontation with Luffy that eventually answers this search, there remains one more crucial thread from this era worth following closely: Kaido's earlier, specific history with Wano itself, predating his final successful conquest, and his complicated relationship with the man who would become his most significant early opponent inside that country, Kozuki Oden. That relationship and the failed first campaign that preceded Kaido's eventual, total conquest of the country deserves its own careful telling, because it represents the first time Kaido's ambitions toward Wano collided directly with organized, capable resistance, and the outcome of that collision would shape everything that followed for the next 2 decades. We turn to that first campaign next, into an era when Wano was still governed by its own rightful lords, when Odin still walked its shores, and when Kaido's eventual total dominance over the country was still very much an open question rather than a settled historical fact. Wano, before Kaido, was not the closed, suffering nation the Straw Hats eventually arrived to liberate. It was something closer to a living legend in its own right, an isolated country of samurai and shogun, sealed off from the rest of the world by its own choice rather than by anyone else's conquest. That isolation matters enormously for understanding why Kaido wanted it at all, because Wano wasn't simply another territory to add to an already sprawling reputation. It was something rarer, a country whose closed borders and unique culture made it functionally invisible to the world government's usual reach, a blind spot in the world's power structure that a man building a permanent fortress would find almost impossible to resist. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how deliberately isolated Wano had kept itself even before Kaido's interest, maintaining its own government, its own military traditions, its own relationship to devil fruits and outside technology, and it becomes clear why this specific country, more than almost anywhere else Kaido could have targeted, offered exactly the kind of self-contained dominion he seemed to be searching for. The ruling structure of Wano at this time centered on the Kozuki family, longtime shoguns of the country, and it was under their rule, specifically during the reign of Kazuki Sukiyaki, that Kaido's earliest documented interest in the country begins to surface in the historical record available to us. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this earliest interest manifests not as immediate conquest, but as something closer to probing, testing the waters of a country whose defenses and internal politics remained largely opaque to outsiders. And it suggests Kaido approached Wano with more caution than his reputation for brute force might initially suggest. This caution makes sense once you consider what made Wano different from every other territory Kaido might have targeted. Its isolation cut both ways. Just as it shielded the country from the world government's usual influence, it also meant Kaido couldn't simply rely on his existing reputation and raw power to guarantee an easy conquest, since Wano's samurai culture had developed its own formidable traditions of combat entirely separate from the wider world's power structures. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Kazuki Oden specifically, the figure who would eventually become Kaido's most significant early adversary within Wano, and notice how unusual his own background was even by the standards of a story full of unusual figures. A former shogun's son who left Wano entirely to sell the seas before eventually returning to challenge Kaido directly. Oden's time outside Wano matters enormously to how this confrontation eventually unfolds, because it means he arrived at his eventual clash with Kaido already tempered by experience the rest of Wano's samurai culture lacked, having sailed with Whitebeard's crew and later with Roger's crew, absorbing combat philosophy and worldview from two of the most legendary figures in pirate history. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this connects Oden directly back to the same generational web this account has traced since the earliest chapters. Roger and Whitebeard both present at God Valley, both survivors of that same catastrophic era, and it means Oden's eventual confrontation with Kaido carries an inherited weight. A continuation of tensions that trace back decades before Oden himself ever set foot on Kaido's radar. This inheritance is worth sitting with, because it means the eventual clash between Kaido and Oden was never simply a local conflict between an invading emperor and a resistant lord. It represented, in a very real sense, an extension of the same generational rivalry this account has followed from God Valley through the Whitebeard confrontations, now playing out through a proxy who carried both legendary lineages within him. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Oden's return to Wano, after years sailing with two of the most significant crews in pirate history, positioned him almost uniquely to recognize exactly what kind of threat Kaido represented, having likely heard first-hand accounts from Roger and Whitebeard themselves about the man who had once been their crewmate under rocks. This recognition would have given Oden a strategic advantage most of Wano's other defenders lacked, genuine, informed understanding of what they were actually facing. Rather than simply confronting Kaido's reputation from a position of isolated ignorance the way the rest of the country initially did. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Kaido's first serious moves against Wano seem to intensify specifically after Oden's return and eventual rise to a position of significant influence within the country. And it raises the question of whether Kaido was drawn toward the challenge Oden specifically represented, another echo of his lifelong pattern of seeking worthy opposition. If that pattern holds, and the broader arc of Kaido's characterization strongly supports it, then Odin may have functioned for Kaido as something adjacent to what Whitebeard represented, not simply an obstacle to conquest, but a genuine test. Someone whose combined lineage and battle-hardened experience made him one of the few people in the world capable of actually giving Kaido the resistance he seemed to crave. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the actual confirmed confrontations between Kaido and Odin during this early campaign period, and notice that unlike Kaido's repeated, ultimately unsuccessful assaults on Whitebeard's territory, his engagements with Odin carry a different tone in how they're eventually recounted, closer to genuine mutual respect forged through combat than simple territorial hostility. This shift in tone matters. Whitebeard's rivalry with Kaido, as established in the previous chapter, seems to have run largely one-directional, Kaido pursuing confrontation that Whitebeard tolerated more than actively sought. With Odin, the dynamic reads differently, closer to two men who each recognize something worthy in the other, even as they stood on opposing sides of Wano's fate. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this mutual recognition eventually complicates the entire arc of Kaido and Odin's relationship, moving beyond simple conqueror versus defender into something considerably stranger, involving imprisonment, unlikely alliance, and eventually a betrayal whose exact contours remain one of the more emotionally complicated sequences in Kaido's entire story. We're getting ahead of the specific events here, and it's worth grounding this chapter in what we can confirm about the initial campaign itself. Kaido's forces moving against Wano's established government, meeting resistance led significantly by Odin and the samurai loyal to him, and a conflict that, crucially, Kaido did not immediately win outright. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this initial resistance actually succeeded, at least temporarily, in repelling or at minimum, significantly delaying Kaido's ambitions toward full conquest, and it stands as one of the relatively rare instances in Kaido's adult life where organized opposition genuinely achieved something against him, echoing the earlier defeat at God Valley more than most of his other confrontations. This partial early success matters enormously for understanding the eventual, stranger turn this conflict takes. Kaido, having encountered genuine resistance capable of at least temporarily checking his ambitions, does not simply escalate to overwhelming force in the way his reputation might suggest. Instead, the story takes an unexpected turn. Odin and Kaido eventually cross paths not purely as enemies, but through a drinking contest that would become one of the more legendary strange episodes in Wano's history. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this drinking contest, occurring alongside Big Mom in an equally strange three-way confrontation, ends not with anyone's clear defeat, but with a kind of exhausted mutual collapse, and it captures something essential about how Odin managed to earn genuine respect from two of the most dangerous people in the world through sheer force of personality, rather than combat alone. This episode deserves attention because it reveals a side of Kaido rarely shown elsewhere in the story, capacity for something approaching genuine camaraderie, however brief, however strange in its circumstances. The man who would later imprison and eventually execute Odin first met him, in this telling, across a drinking table, matching him cup for cup in a contest that apparently left lasting impressions on everyone involved. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this early camaraderie complicates everything that follows, because it means Kaido's eventual treatment of Odin cannot be read as simple, uncomplicated conquest of a stranger. It has to be understood as the betrayal, or at minimum the brutal subordination, of someone Kaido had genuinely, if briefly, respected. This complication matters because it deepens the tragedy of what eventually happens between them, transforming their story from a simple conqueror versus resistance narrative into something closer to a fractured relationship between two men who might, under different circumstances, have found real common ground, undone instead by the specific brutal logic of Kaido's ambitions toward permanent dominion. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Odin's own choices throughout this period, including decisions that seem, at least on their surface, difficult to fully justify strategically, suggest a man wrestling with competing loyalties, to his country, to his own restless nature, and eventually to a bargain with Kaido that would define the rest of both their lives. That bargain, and the complicated, ultimately tragic arrangement it produced, forms the core of the next major chapter in this account, moving from this initial campaign of resistance and unlikely camaraderie into the darker territory of imprisonment, betrayal, and the eventual execution that would come to define Wano's suffering for the next 20 years. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this transition, from grudging respect to eventual brutal betrayal, mirrors patterns already established elsewhere in Kaido's story. A man capable of genuine, if inconsistent, respect for worthy individuals, who nonetheless proves willing to sacrifice that respect entirely whenever it conflicts with his larger ambitions toward permanent, unbreakable dominion. This inconsistency isn't contradiction so much as hierarchy. Kaido seems capable of valuing individual strength and character deeply, as shown through his treatment of Oden during their early encounters, while simultaneously treating that same value as fully subordinate to his overriding need for structural security. The fortress-building instinct this account has traced back to God Valley's original wound. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how thoroughly this hierarchy, respect subordinated to security, would eventually play out not just with Oden but throughout Kaido's entire rule over Wano, a pattern of individual moments of genuine regard for specific people existing alongside a broader, unyielding commitment to absolute control that ultimately overrides any individual relationship, no matter how meaningful it might have briefly been. We turn next to the specific mechanics of that eventual betrayal, the bargain Oden struck, the imprisonment that followed, and the 21 guardians whose oath would eventually become the seed of the resistance that, decades later, would finally challenge Kaido's rule in the exact way this earliest campaign first suggested might someday be possible. That story, the deal, the weight, and the execution that would echo across 2 decades of Wano's suffering, deserves its own complete telling. And it begins with a choice Oden made that many in Wano would spend years struggling to understand. There's a version of this story where Oden simply loses to Kaido, a straightforward military defeat that ends Wano's independence in a single decisive stroke. And the fact that this is not what actually happens tells you almost everything you need to know about how strange, how genuinely unprecedented, Oden's final choice actually was. Instead of continuing outright military resistance, Oden made a decision that has puzzled and moved readers in roughly equal measure ever since it was revealed. He willingly surrendered, offering himself into Kaido's custody under specific terms, choosing captivity over continued open warfare in a gamble whose full logic only becomes clear much later. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the actual terms of this arrangement, and notice that Oden's surrender was not unconditional, but tied to a specific time frame, a bet that within a set period he would prove something, either to Kaido directly or to history more broadly, about what kind of resistance was actually possible against him. This detail matters because it reframes the entire imprisonment that follows, not as simple defeat but as a calculated wager, one where Oden essentially staked his own freedom, and eventually his life, on the belief that patience and eventual revelation would accomplish something outright military force could not. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how uncharacteristic this kind of long-game strategic patience seems, for a character otherwise defined by impulsiveness throughout most of his backstory, someone whose earlier life is marked by dramatic, often reckless decisions rather than careful, extended planning, and it suggests something had shifted in Oden by the time he made this specific choice. That shift likely traces back to fatherhood, to his growing awareness of Wano's long-term needs extending beyond his own lifetime, and to a maturity that seems to have developed specifically in response to the stakes involved, a country's entire future, rather than simply his own personal glory or survival. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Kaido responded to this surrender, choosing imprisonment over immediate execution despite having no obvious strategic reason to keep a defeated rival alive, and it suggests the earlier established camaraderie, the drinking contest, the mutual respect, genuinely factored into Kaido's decision, making in a way his broader reputation for casual brutality might not predict. This choice to imprison rather than immediately execute stands as one of the clearest pieces of evidence throughout Kaido's entire story that his respect for Oden specifically was real, not merely narrative convenience, since a man otherwise willing to burn entire villages without hesitation chose restraint here, for reasons the text leaves largely implicit, but that pattern strongly suggests. Trace back to that early shared history. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the actual conditions of Oden's imprisonment, held for a fixed period under specific terms, and notice how unusual this arrangement is compared to how Kaido typically handles resistance elsewhere in his broader operation, suggesting Oden occupied a genuinely unique position in Kaido's psychology, unlike almost anyone else he ever encountered. During this imprisonment, the boiling punishment Oden endured, a public execution method involving repeated submersion in boiling oil, stands as one of the more genuinely harrowing sequences in the entire manga, made more devastating by Odin's refusal to show pain, to give his tormentors the satisfaction of visible suffering across what became an extended, grueling ordeal. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this specific punishment functions less as straightforward execution and more as a kind of prolonged test, extending well beyond what would be necessary for simple death. And it reinforces the reading of this entire period as Kaido testing Odin's resolve, rather than simply eliminating him as quickly and efficiently as possible. This testing dynamic connects directly back to everything established in earlier chapters about Kaido's lifelong search for worthy opposition, someone capable of genuinely testing his own limits, and Odin's calm endurance throughout an ordeal designed to break him may have represented for Kaido exactly the kind of proof of worthiness he'd been seeking since his earliest post-Rocks years. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the people of Wano, particularly the 21 retainers who would eventually become central to the resistance against Kaido, responded to witnessing this ordeal, and notice how their loyalty seems to have crystallized specifically around this display of endurance, transforming Odin's suffering into the foundational myth of their eventual rebellion. This transformation, suffering into myth, into motivation, into the seed of organized resistance, mirrors a pattern this account has already traced elsewhere in Kaido's story, where individual moments of pain and endurance become the raw material for legends that outlast the specific circumstances that created them. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Odin's wife Toki factors into this entire arrangement, possessing a devil fruit power, allowing her to send people forward through time. And it becomes clear that Odin's willingness to endure this imprisonment was likely bound up with a larger, more complicated plan involving his family's specific, extraordinary abilities. Toki's power, the Toki Toki no Mi, allowing its user to send themselves or others into the future, adds a dimension to this entire story that complicates any simple reading of Odin's imprisonment as purely about proving a point to Kaido. It suggests Odin and Toki were, from the beginning, thinking on a timescale extending well beyond their own lives. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this timeline eventually connects to the specific date, 20 years into the future, that becomes central to the entire Wano arc structure, a date Odin and Toki apparently anticipated well before Kaido's eventual execution of Odin made it tragically relevant to everyone who survived him. This foreknowledge, if the timeline holds as most interpretations suggest, means Odin's entire gambit with Kaido was never really about winning his own freedom or even his own survival. It was about buying time, specifically 20 years of time, positioning his children and his retainers to eventually mount the resistance that his own generation, however skilled, could not accomplish alone. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how devastating this reading becomes once fully absorbed. A father who understood with something close to certainty that his own death was likely inevitable, choosing instead to focus his remaining efforts on ensuring his son and his loyal retainers would have exactly the window of opportunity needed decades later. This is worth sitting with directly, because it transforms Odin's entire arc from simple tragic resistance into something closer to deliberate long-term sacrifice. A man who accepted almost certain death not as failure, but as the necessary cost of a plan whose payoff he would never personally witness. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Kaido, for his part, seems to have remained genuinely unaware of the full scope of this plan throughout the entire period of Odin's imprisonment, treating the arrangement as a straightforward test of resolve, rather than recognizing it as part of a much longer strategic game being played against him. This gap in awareness matters because it means Kaido's eventual decision to execute Odin, arriving after the boiling punishment failed to break him within its allotted time, was made without full understanding of what that execution would actually set in motion, a decision he likely believed closed the matter permanently, rather than opening the door to exactly the resistance he'd spent his life trying to prevent. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the specific timing of Odin's execution, occurring after he survived the full extent of the boiling punishment, technically fulfilling the terms of the original wager Odin had proposed, and notice that Kaido's choice to execute him anyway represents a betrayal not just of Odin personally, but of the specific terms Kaido himself had apparently agreed to. This betrayal deserves emphasis because it complicates any reading of Kaido as simply following through on predetermined honest terms. Whatever respect existed between these two men, whatever genuine camaraderie the earlier drinking contest represented, it ultimately proved insufficient to override Kaido's need for absolute security. Echoing the same hierarchy established in the previous chapter, respect subordinated to control. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this specific betrayal, breaking terms he himself had set, tracks with Kaido's broader pattern throughout his life of ultimately prioritizing structural dominance over personal relationships. No matter how genuine those relationships might have briefly seemed, a pattern this account has already traced back to the aftermath of God Valley. The execution itself, when it finally arrives, is staged publicly, deliberately visible to the population of Wano, transforming what might have been a private matter of imprisonment and punishment into a calculated demonstration of Kaido's absolute authority over the entire country. A message aimed not just at Oden, but at everyone who might consider resistance in the future. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this public staging ultimately backfires in the longest possible term, since the very visibility Kaido intended as deterrent instead became the founding trauma of the resistance that would, decades later, finally challenge his rule, proving that spectacle intended to crush hope can, under the right circumstances, become the seed of its opposite. This irony deserves attention because it suggests a genuine miscalculation on Kaido's part. A man whose entire strategy toward Wano rested on preventing exactly the kind of organized resistance God Valley had once demonstrated was possible against even the most dominant power, inadvertently creating the specific conditions for that resistance to eventually form. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the 21 retainers specifically, witnesses to Oden's execution who swore an oath in its immediate aftermath to survive, however long it took, until the day they could finally act against Kaido. And it becomes clear that this oath, sworn in a moment of raw grief and fury, would become the load-bearing structure of everything that follows for the next 2 decades. That oath and the 20 years of patient, dangerous survival it demanded from people who had every reason to believe they might not live to see its fulfillment deserves its own careful examination, because it represents one of the more remarkable displays of sustained, disciplined resistance anywhere in this story's broader history. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this 20-year waiting period functions as the direct inverse of everything Kaido had built his identity around since childhood: patience against his impulsiveness, collective sacrifice against his individual dominance. And it sets up the eventual confrontation not simply as strength against strength, but as 2 fundamentally different philosophies of survival finally meeting after decades of separate development. We turn next to that waiting period itself, the 20 years of occupation that followed Oden's execution, examining what Wano actually became under Kaido's consolidated rule, and how the country's suffering during this period shaped both the resistance quietly building beneath the surface and the broader operations Kaido was running throughout the wider world during this same span of time. That examination requires stepping back from the immediate emotional weight of Oden's death to consider the colder, more structural question of what an entire country actually experiences under 2 decades of occupation by a man whose relationship to power had been shaped by every trauma and every ambition this account has traced from his earliest childhood forward. Occupation, in most stories, gets compressed into montage, a handful of images meant to suggest suffering without requiring the audience to sit inside its actual duration, and Wano's 20 years under Kaido resists that compression more than almost anything else in this narrative, precisely because the story insists on showing us the accumulated weight of that time. The mechanism of control that made this occupation possible wasn't simply Kaido's own overwhelming strength, though that mattered enormously. It was a puppet government, installed and maintained specifically to give Wano's suffering the appearance of legitimate internal rule rather than obvious foreign conquest. And the man Kaido chose for that role was Orochi. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how carefully this arrangement was constructed. Orochi installed as shogun while Kaido operated largely from Onigashima, physically separate from the daily administration of the country, and it suggests a level of political calculation that complicates any reading of Kaido as purely a blunt instrument of force without strategic sophistication. This division of labor, Kaido's raw power backing Orochi's administrative cruelty, allowed both men to specialize in what each did best. Kaido provided the underlying threat that made resistance seem hopeless. Orochi provided the day-to-day machinery of oppression, the taxation, the surveillance, the specific bureaucratic cruelty that ground down the population over years rather than through any single dramatic act. Another quiet detail appears when you look at Orochi's own devil fruit ability, granting him the form of a massive 8-headed serpent, and notice how this power, while formidable, remained clearly subordinate to Kaido's own strength throughout their entire arrangement, a hierarchy Orochi seems to have understood and accepted in exchange for the authority and indulgence his position provided him. This arrangement reveals something important about how Kaido structures power relationships more broadly, allowing subordinates significant autonomy and authority within their assigned domains, while ensuring always that his own position at the absolute top of the hierarchy remains unquestioned and unquestionable, a pattern consistent with everything established about the Beast Pirates' broader organizational structure. Another quiet detail appears when you look at the specific mechanisms of suffering this arrangement produced across Wano's population. Food shortages deliberately engineered or at minimum tolerated, oppressive taxation crushing ordinary citizens, and a systematic destruction of the country's traditional culture in favor of whatever served Kaido and Orochi's combined interests. The Flower District and the broader entertainment economy that develops in Wano's capital during this period deserves specific attention, because it represents one of the more insidious aspects of the occupation, a superficial prosperity for those closest to power existing alongside genuine desperation for everyone else, creating a visible contrast the narrative uses repeatedly to illustrate the true cost of this arrangement. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this contrast, luxury for the connected, desperation for everyone else, mirrors patterns of exploitation this account has already traced in Kaido's broader operations. The smile fruit production discussed in earlier chapters representing a similar dynamic, benefit concentrated at the top while suffering gets distributed downward. Wano under this occupation becomes in effect a smaller scale demonstration of exactly the kind of extractive, exploitative system Kaido had already built throughout his wider criminal operations, applied now with total, unchecked authority to an entire country, rather than distributed across various territories and partnerships. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how the population suffering during this period gets specifically weaponized against any potential resistance. Citizens made to understand that any uprising would result in collective punishment, rather than simply consequences for those directly involved. A strategy that effectively turns the population itself into a kind of hostage against its own. Liberation. This collective punishment dynamic explains much of why organized resistance took so long to actually materialize, despite clear grievance existing throughout the entire occupation period, since any individual act of defiance risked catastrophic consequences not just for the person responsible, but for their families, their communities, everyone connected to them within Wano's tightly bound social structure. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this dynamic specifically shaped the strategy eventually adopted by the surviving retainers loyal to Odin's memory, understanding that open rebellion before adequate preparation would result not just in their own deaths, but in devastating retaliation against the broader population, forcing them into decades of careful, quiet preparation rather than earlier, more impulsive action. This patience, imposed by circumstance rather than simply chosen freely, meant the resistance had to develop an entirely different character than most rebellions typically shown elsewhere in this story, built not on dramatic uprising, but on sustained, quiet endurance, gathering resources and allies across decades while maintaining the appearance of defeated compliance. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how several of the retainers specifically adapted to survive within this system, some taking on roles that required apparent collaboration with the occupying regime, and it reveals the genuine moral complexity involved in sustained resistance under total, overwhelming occupation, where survival itself sometimes required choices that would look, from the outside, disturbingly close to complicity. This complexity deserves acknowledgement because it complicates any simple heroic narrative of the resistance, presenting instead something closer to the genuine texture of survival under occupation, where clean moral lines become luxuries that people actually living through the circumstances rarely have the option to maintain. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how Momonosuke, Odin's son, factors into this entire period, sent forward through time by his mother's devil fruit power specifically to survive into the era when resistance might finally become viable, and notice how much weight gets placed on a child who had no say in the sacrifice being made on his behalf. This detail connects back to the discussion of Toki's foreknowledge in the previous chapter, confirming that the entire structure of this eventual resistance was built, from its very origins, around a specific deliberately chosen future date, meaning the 20 years of suffering this chapter describes were, in a real sense, always understood by at least some participants as having a defined endpoint. Another quiet detail appears when you look at how this foreknowledge, existing among a small circle while the broader population suffered without any such certainty, raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of sacrifice made on behalf of people who never consented to it. Questions the narrative doesn't fully resolve but does seem aware of, given how much weight gets placed on the cost borne by ordinary citizens throughout this period.